Hi, my name is Chris Greenway. Today I'm going to walk through a manual calibration on this TV. Within Calman, we do have some manual calibration workflows, and I'm going to do an SDR calibration on the TV first. I'll leave that set as SDR. We're going to go through connecting to our hardware. I've got my portrait display C6 right here and my portrait display's G1 pattern generator. Those are what I'm going to use for the calibration today. I am connected to the C6 now. Just so you can see, that lights up on the side when it's connected. And then in Calman, I now have a green indicator light on the meter tab. I have this set for Samsung QLED for the meter mode already. That's going to be a good mode for this TV. I'm going to connect to my G1. If it's not already selected, you can just search for portrait displays in this list and the G1. This pattern generator does support auto discovery, so you'll see that mine is already listed right here, and I can just select it and hit connect. Each pattern generator connects a little bit differently. Some are going to be over USB or serial over USB, so you might have to select a serial port, and others will connect over IP, but you might need to type in the IP manually. Just kind of depends on what generator you're using. All right, you can see that I pulled up this alignment pattern. On this pattern, I am nicely centered on the screen. Gives me the ability to make sure that that meter is placed right in the middle. And because I'm going to be doing an SDR calibration, this display does have some local dimming behavior I'd like to avoid. I'm going to use full window patterns. If you're ever unsure which right patterns to use is on your given display, you can reach out to our support. You can also just play around with different window sizes and see if some have bizarrely different behaviors than others. What those behaviors might be can vary. It could be that that you might not be getting consistent readings. All right, our calibration targets have been set for our calibration already. We're defaulting to a 709 color space, and that's our SDR standard. D65 white point, that's our standard white point, and I'm defaulting to a BT 1886 as my gamma formula. I'm going to use this in a brighter room, and I kind of want it to be something different, so I'm going to change that to a power formula and 2.2. There's a couple of reasons why you might want to change that to different values, but you can use your discretion to see what's best for your situation. In terms of meter positioning, this alignment pattern makes that really easy. For a flat screen TV, what we want to do is we want to generally be measuring in the center of the TV. And then also, we want to be sure with these contact meters that they are really flush on the surface of the screen, that we don't have any light coming in from the sides that might affect our readings. All right, now I'm going to take some pre-calibration readings. That's just going to give me a baseline of where we started, where we're ending up. On the pre-calibration readings, you're going to see a couple things. We've got an RGB balance chart. That's going to give us our red, green, and blue balance, how close we are to that D65 white point. We have a color checker chart as well, and that color checker chart is going to show us how close we're coming to the targets within that color checker. We like to use that color checker chart here because it gives us some real world content types of patches that we're measuring instead of just measuring the primaries, for example. Okay, and so as I'm measuring, overall, the RGB balance isn't too bad. We've got a little bit of red low on there. For the grayscale, well, those color checker measurements are coming in. What I'd ideally like to see on this chart is I'd like to see that the red, green, and blue lines all line up right along this 100% line here. And ideally, I'd like to see DE values under 1 if possible. It looks like I'm getting DE values kind of in the 3 to 4 range mostly. And again, ideally, what I'd really like to see there is, if possible, as much of that below 1 as we can see. While this is going through, there's a couple of settings that we can set in Calman, and I'm going to look at a couple of them here in just a moment, that might be able to speed up our readings a little. You want to be a little careful as you change things too much, but we do have this optimize feature for how much of a delay we put in on our readings, and that's the delay between when we send the patch to the screen and when we actually take the reading. Right now I have that set up at 1.5 seconds. I think I'll be able to turn that down, for at least for my SDR calibration. I'm going to try it down at 0.75 and see if I notice anything. Also, there are application options for adding in patch insertion. We often do that when we do HDR calibrations, and those can definitely slow us down a little bit on our readings. I'm going to turn the patch insertion off, and then I turn my delay down. I'm going to just take a grayscale set of readings again. The keyboard shortcut is S. You can take just the readings for whatever of the selected chart is. I'm just going to make sure that those track pretty well with what I was just seeing, that I don't see any big differences in what I measured with the longer delay. That delay seems to be just fine. I am still seeing the same type of behavior there. One of the most important steps when you're doing a manual calibration is just making sure you get into the right mode to do the calibration. So at this point, let's go and poke through on the menu of the TV a little bit. So I already have this set in filmmaker mode because I figure filmmaker mode is probably a pretty good option. Turns off a lot of the motion smoothing type of stuff that I don't want on anyway. And so it generally will set me up in a pretty good position. Let's look at the other picture modes I have available. I have filmmaker mode. Movie's another good option. Should have fairly complete calibration controls. Eco is probably not going to be an appropriate mode for calibration. It will probably have some of the local dimming type of behaviors to try and maintain that eco mode. That will make it hard for us getting a good calibration, because we'll probably struggle a little bit on getting reliable results. Standard may or may not, I'm not sure, and then dynamic often will have some dynamic things in there that'll make it hard for us to do regular measurements and have a good calibration. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this in filmmaker mode, and I'm going to check what the controls I have are in here. So I have a brightness control. Just as a note, this brightness control is because if this is a Samsung TV, is not going to affect brightness coming out of black behavior as on many TVs. Instead, this is going to be my general backlight type control. I have a contrast control. I have a sharpness control, color tuner, a tint. Can apply my picture settings to all sources. I have a picture clarity control, local dimming, contrast enhancer. I'm going to go ahead and turn my local dimming to low. We'll do a check on that. Contrast enhancer, I have color tone, I have white balance control, gamma. I did say I was going to calibrate this to 2.2, so I'll set the TV to that and hope that gives me good access. I have a color space setting on here, auto, native, and custom. We'll give that a try when we get to the color space. I have color booster, which is turned off, and smart calibration reset picture. Okay, excellent. I'm going to take one more set of measurements on my pre-cal and just see if that local dimming changed anything. Because I'm using full field patterns, I don't anticipate that it should have. I think just our grayscale measurements should be enough there. I do see similar red, green, and blue balance issues as I did before. A little bit different, but not too much. All right. Next, I'm going to look at my brightness. On the brightness, what we're looking at here is for how the TV is coming out of black. So this pattern has 0 through 23 bit levels. 16 is our video black. What we want is for everything below 16 and lower to fade into the background. Anything 17 and higher, we want to start to make those. We want to start to be able to see those differences. And again, this brightness control on the TV is not actually a brightness control. It's more of a backlight control. So you can see that it does have some change, but it's mostly just changing the entire luminance of the screen. So we'll adjust that control in a moment when we set our luminance. Instead, I'm going to go through here and look for our shadow detail on this TV. And the first thing I do if I'm using a control I'm not completely familiar with is I do just kind of check the range. So I turn it all the way up, turn it all the way down. The shadow detail, if I turn it all the way down, I can still make out values starting about 20 or 21. And if I turn it all the way up, I notice that when I'm turned up to 5, we still have a hard clip at black. So 16 and lower are all blending into the background still. But the difference between 16 and 17 becomes much more pronounced. So we're coming out of black much faster here. I don't want it to be anything extreme here. What I want is the first level that I think I can start to see those differences. And I can just see the difference at 17 with a setting of 1. With a setting of 2, I can see it just a tiny bit better, which I'm going to use this in a brighter room. I think that that's going to be more appropriate. This studio lighting is probably actually a good indicator for where I'm going to be using this TV. I'm going to go with 2 on this one. If I was using this in a dimmer room, I would have left that down at 1. Okay, next I'm going to look at my contrast control. On the contrast, we're looking at some things that are fairly similar to what we did for brightness. The difference is what we're looking for is our 235 is our white level. We do have valid content that can be up above 235 in the super white range up to 255. So it's fine if I still see these boxes. I'm not trying to get those hard clipped off at 235, for example. What I do want to look for, though, is that I can see the boxes up to at least 235 and that I don't have any clipping happening there. And then also that I don't see any color shift on here. So as I turn this control all the way up, notice that that essentially gets blasted all out. I don't see any difference in any of the boxes. I can't see a noticeable box here, here, or here. As I turn it down just a little bit, I do see some of the boxes. These boxes do appear to have a little bit of color shift to my eye. I'm going to turn it down a little bit more and see if that looks like it goes away. Okay, so I'm down to 35 on this control now, out of a possible range up to 50. The color shift that I thought I saw is now gone. I'm going to turn it up until I just start to see that color shift happen, then turn it back down one click. Okay, I'm starting to see just a little bit of color shift here in my bottom row. So I'm going to turn it down one more click and leave it there at 37. Now within Calman, we do have a measurement for that clipping as well. Excellent. So with that control set at 37, I'm seeing on here what I would really hope to see, which is the red, the green, and the blue. They aren't necessarily balanced together, but they do track right along with each other. You can see just the tiniest dip in the red right at the very top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and adjust that control again. And this time I'm going to turn it back up and show you what that chart would look like with it up where we think it's going to be doing some clipping. Do that same set of measurements, and this time you see that my red starts to dip down lower a bit faster than the green and the blue, but I do have a difference there in the red, green, and blue. So again, I'm going to set that back to where I wasn't seeing that clipping and I wasn't seeing that color shift. Take one more series of readings there, and then I do want to also set my backlight level. So I'm going to set this in a brighter room, but I'm currently getting about just under 400 nits on this TV, super white. I don't really want it to be that bright. So I think I'm going to set this to about 225 nits overall. So I'm just going to do a continuous reading at white and see where I'm at. So I'm rating about 330 nits right now. I do want to turn that down a little bit. This is a little bit brighter than I would want it for the room I'm planning on putting this in. Sometimes we get asked what the right luminance level is, and ultimately the answer is it's up to you. It just makes whatever is going to make the most sense for your viewing environment. If I was in a really dim room, I would calibrate it the same way I'd calibrate in a studio. I'd calibrate it down to 100 nits if I was in a completely light controlled room. But since this one's not going to be in a completely light controlled room, it's going to be in essentially a living room type of situation. I'm gonna aim for a little bit higher. I think about 225 nits is where I want this. But again, use your judgment in the room you're going to be watching it in. Make sure that it's set up correctly for you. Now, as I said, I'm going to target 225 nits. I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. That's one of the things that we expect to see as we go through the calibration, is that we'll probably end up losing a little bit of luminance along the way as we do especially as we do our RGB balance. So just to account for that, first I'm going to turn it up, and then we'll check the luminance again before we finish. All right, next one is we're going to do our 2-point white balance. Now for our 2-point white balance control, what we're looking to do is take general controls for the highs and the lows and adjust our red, green, and blue for that D65 white point. Into the menu, and you might have to poke around a little bit to find controls. Again, that's a big part of doing manual calibration, especially if on a TV you're not familiar with, is just spending a little bit of time familiarizing yourself with what the controls are, where they are, and if you're not sure, cranking on them a little bit and seeing what they do. So I'm going to go into white balance here, 2 points, and I'm going to start at the top end. So my gains, so I've got gains and offsets on this. The gains align with the top end, the offsets align with the lower end. I'm going to start with the top end as it's more likely to have more effect on the lower end. But these two controls are pretty broad range in how much they're going to affect. So we want to use a little bit of caution. We're going to bounce back and forth a couple times, make sure that as we adjust one, we're seeing how it's going to affect the other one. All right, and on this control, ideally, again, what I'm looking for is DEs under 1 if possible. I'm seeing a DE of about 2.5, and I'm seeing a little bit red low. So I'm going to just start by turning that red up a little bit and see how much I can pull that in. Okay, that's looking really close. I might see if I pull out one click of blue. Okay, that looks really nice. So I'm now down a very low DE. If I do a hover over on that, I can actually see what the value is. Looks like it's measuring it at 0.3. Okay, now we're going to check and see what that looks like at the low end. So the adjustments I made at the high end, as I said, will affect the low end. It looks like the low end is already looking a little bit better than it was before. And all right, with that one change, I'm seeing a DE that's very, very small. I don't know if I can have enough pixels to get the rollover text on that. Doesn't look like it. That's where we want it to be. Too small of an error for us to be able to get the rollover. Okay, so that looks great. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to pull that menu off the screen. I want to make sure that that menu wasn't affecting my measurements. I see a very tiny difference at the 30% after doing that change. It's not enough that I'm at all concerned about it. I now am seeing a DE value of 0.4, so that's still well within my range of under 1. And it's also, that's a great time to point out that as we do continuous measurements, there's going to be slight fluctuations in what the TV is doing based on the temperature, based on the circuitry. There's going to be slight repeatability differences with meter reading to reading. So that 0.4, if I just take repeated readings, I might see that shift again, even if I'm not making any changes. So at some point, if you can end up where you're just chasing in circles if you try and get everything to 0, for example. All right, before I start the multipoint calibration, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a set of readings. Again, this is a good decision point in doing a manual calibration is how much adjustment you want to make, if you're making adjustments just to make adjustments, or if you're making adjustments to really improve the picture quality. So what I'm going to look at here is I know that I have pretty good RGB balance on the low end and on the high end, so I'm hoping that that's balanced pretty well across the board, but we'll see that in a moment here. And the next thing I'm going to be looking at is how the gamma response is tracking. So that's how close we're tracking on our gamma chart. Ideally, we want to see all these measurements line up right on this yellow line. And it looks like right now they are measuring really close. So I could certainly go in and make some single point adjustments to try and fine tune things. But in this case, there's really very, very little to do there. I'll demonstrate what that looks like just so that you can see it. Now, what controls are available on the TV can certainly vary, and how effective they are and how well they line up is also a good thing that can good thing to remember that can vary. I go in here and I'm going to turn on the 20-point control, and I'm going to just do, I think I selected 60. So I'm going to select the 60 point, and I'm going to go in and make some live changes. So we're going to do what we did before. I'm going to set this to read continuously. I'm going to start cranking on those controls a little bit. And that's good. We can see as I make some pretty massive changes there, we can see that they're affecting right away. They bumped the DE on that value up to about 8. And so one thing that we can use these controls for is, and again, right now we're balanced really well, so I'm not going to try and do that, but is we can use it to adjust the luminance at a certain point if we aren't tracking gamma very well. So for example, if I wanted the luminance a little bit higher at one point, you can see that now I'm about 4 nits over my target luminance here. You can look on the chart here and see that 73 was my target, and I'm hitting it about 77. You can see a little bump there, and you can see that bump reflected a little bit more clearly here. You can also see that I've just introduced error, which is almost all in luminance. So I'm going to turn those back down now. Now I'm sure somebody in the comments will come and point out that I could probably do some more fine tuning at these low levels coming out of black and maybe get that tuned up a little bit more in that for luminance. And again, this is the point where I'm going to not spend a bunch of time trying to dial those in. I'm going to use my DEs as my guide. I am under DE of 1 across the board, and in terms of what that means for my calibration, that means I have no visible calibration issues with this TVA, so right on my grayscale. So I'm not going to actually do those adjustments. All right, color space is next. I'm going to go ahead and take a full set of readings on this one. Now there's a couple of options that we can do when we are doing our color space measurements. This chart is set up right now to measure at 100%, so fully saturated colors. You'll notice on this chart that those are pretty oversaturated. I do have this drop down here though for selecting different levels, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that over to 75. I prefer to calibrate at 75 for my CMS if I have a CMS system, and the reason I say that is because most of my content is not going to be all the way at the very edges of the of the usable color gamut. Instead, where a lot of that content is going to be is on interior spaces. If I have a single control that's going to affect kind of the whole red region, like for example, this whole region here, then what I want to do is I want to get that in a place where I think it's going to give me the best value for the calibration. So when I'm looking at a CMS calibration, I try and target at 75% more. There's going to be more, so it's a little bit balanced, and we're looking at where more real content is going to be. Especially real content that our eyes might be more sensitive to, things like skin tones, where we want it to really be something where people look natural. So again, that's why I would choose 75 over 100 for where I do the calibration. Okay, and on this one, I do see we're a little bit oversaturated. So what I'm going to do is we'll go in settings, and we're going to look for our CMS controls. Now this one, I did see that when we were flipping through here earlier. Color space settings set to auto. We're going to change that to custom here so we have access to these controls. And we'll just start with red. And again, just like before, I'm going to set Calman to do some continuous measurements. And because I'm oversaturated, so different manufacturers will have different methods of managing their CMS. On this Samsung TV, for example, the CMS system is based on red, green, blue at additivity or taking it out. And so this is on this TV in Calman, I've got this red, green, blue balance chart down below. And this is the one I've used to try and adjust for the controls here. I do want to make sure I'm reading the right color. And on this one, what I see on this RGB chart down below is that red is a little bit high and green is a little bit low. So if I try and adjust those, I can turn the red down. Now what I'm noticing is I'm turning this down and I don't seem to be seeing anything. Just a good point to check and see if the control is functioning at all. So I'm just going to turn it all the way. And my readings are staying very, very consistent. I can see that readings are changing just a little bit. And I do notice the meter flickering. I do notice in Calman my meter tab pulsing. So those are good indications that I am still taking readings. Just to confirm. Okay, if I turn that around, I'm definitely getting readings, so it looks like this control is not functioning at all. So I might not be able to do a full CMS calibration. We'll make some additional adjustments on here. We'll just check with the blue as well. Okay, that one also seems to be having no noticeable effect. And I'm going to just check on another color as well. Back to yellow. Try one of the secondaries. All the way down. All the way up. That doesn't look like it's doing anything either. We'll set that back to where it was, and I'm going to set that color space control back from custom to auto in that case, since I'm not making any adjustments there. Okay, one thing that I can see on this screen is that I do still see that my colors appear to be mostly oversaturated. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try and see if I can just globally adjust color, my color control. I'm just going to select green. I'm going to select one of my primaries here, and I'm going to adjust that global control. Now at this point, it's pretty rough control to be adjusting to try and bring everything into alignment. So I want to be fairly careful, knowing that this control is going to affect a lot of things on the TV. But I'm going to just turn it down a couple clicks, see if that brings that green saturation more into alignment. That looks better. I'm going to DE of 2 on that green. Now, I have turned it down quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure through the full suite of colors, see how that affects all of them. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to measure at multiple saturation levels to really try and get a better idea of how much it's affected the whole presentation of color on the TV. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over and do 25% sweeps. And I'm going to say on this, I'm going to rename this tab color set to 16. That's because I want to just be able to look back and say, oh yeah, that's right, that's what I did on that one. Mostly that's going to be there just to jog my memory. Okay, so as I look at the red values coming in, it looks like most of those are just a shy undersaturated now. I do notice that my primaries are still pretty oversaturated. Based on where I'm seeing those control values for red, for blue, for cyan, I think I'm going to turn that color control up by just 1 or 2 and try that again. So because I'm adjusting one control that's going to affect a bunch of readings, I'm just going to open some new history tabs as I go along. And that'll give me the chance to be able to toggle between and see how they affected each other. So I'm going to turn that up by 2, see how that does. All right, so those are coming in. Those look, I think, just a little bit better to me than what I had for 16. But let's toggle back and check. This one, we'll rename this tab as well. All right. Color 16. Yeah, those look a little bit more compressed over here, a little bit less saturated. These look like they're hitting closer onto the targets. I think that looks like it's probably a pretty good value to leave that at. I do want to check one more thing, which is when we started, our default value for that color control was 25. And I do want to just check and see how that measures. Again, because it's a fairly global control, I'm just trying to be careful, make sure that what I'm doing is not worse than it was when I started. It does look like with that color control turned up, I do have more oversaturation throughout the whole range. So that's kind of what I thought I was seeing. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that control at that value, 18 value. I did want to do a couple of visual verifications too, though. So on the G1, and on many pattern generators, we will have some visual verification patterns that you can bring up, things like real images. So this one is our 5 people image, and it has some skin tones on it, so we can look for any like oversaturated colors. We can look for anything where the colors seem to be clipping off into themselves, so we're getting kind of big blobs of color where there should be nice smooth gradients. At 25, I looked at this pattern a lot of times. The people do look just a little bit oversaturated. I'm going to go ahead and turn that down to 18, which was the value that looked like it was measuring better. The difference is pretty subtle. It's probably won't capture too well on the camera, but in the red dress here, there's definitely some texture loss when I'm up at 25. So that's good to see corrected as I turn that down a little bit. Overall, the colors still look like they're well represented, so I'm happy with that change in that color control overall to do my correction. Again, if I had, I prefer to do those corrections with CMS so that I do have a little bit more fine-grained control. While I've got visual verification patterns up, I did want to bring up one more, which is our Granger pattern. The Granger pattern gives these nice smooth gradients, and so as I'm doing control like color, that's this big global control, it's a good one to see if we have any like clipping or anything. So I'm going to end up setting this back to 18, I think, but I do want to look at this and just see what it looks like as I turn this control all the way. So as I can turn it all the way down, you'll notice that I do desaturate down to just a grayscale. And as I turn it back up, you'll notice that as if I turn it up too high, I think this will come through on the camera that I do have some big color blocks and blobs. I no longer have these nice smooth transitions. So it's a good point to see that if I here at 43, and again, that's turned up pretty high, I do have some weird artifacts that start showing up on this pattern. But again, I'm going to set this back to 18 where it had overall the best color representation through the CMS. All right, now that I've done those steps of the calibration, I'm going to recheck that luminance. I was at about 230 nits before I knew that we were going to drop a little bit as we did the calibration. My target was 225. I'm pretty much spot on for my target now. So I could certainly go through and adjust it if I wanted to, but when I made one-click adjustments on that control before, they were definitely more than that. So I'm right on my target. All right, and here's an important thing that we do in Calman is we do a post-calibration validation, and we do it as a separate step from all of our calibration steps. That way, if we do make changes to the control like color, and it happens to have an effect on how the RGB cuts and gains behave, or maybe some other control that we adjusted will have effects on another control. This gives us a full sweep after the fact where we're checking the whole calibration at once and making sure that there wasn't any interaction between controls there that could have negatively affected. So on this one, my RGB balance chart is done already. The results are looking exactly like I want them to. We've got a max DE of 1 and across the board excellent DE values. Our average is just about 0.4 DE. And on our color checker, we see a lot of improvement over our pre-cal readings. All right, and so now I'm just going to show our pre-post compare. So I was already in a pretty good state on this filmmaker mode when I started the calibration. Nothing was extremely out of line or anything like that. But I did have DEs average of about 3 on our grayscale and about 4 on our color checker. After calibration, our grayscale average DE is down to 0.4, and our average color checker is about 1.4. And again, what we're really aiming for there is, if at all possible, we try and hit under 1, and that would be no visible color error. So overall, this now looks like a great calibration. Very happy with that, even though I didn't have access to some controls I really would have liked to have adjusted. Next, I'm going to do the HDR side. So I'm going to go back in here. We're going to select HDR. And an important note is to make sure that you get your generator set up correctly for HDR as well. So a couple of things. We do have the window size right here, but we're going to set that to a 10% window. And we're also going to make sure we turn on the HDR metadata. So we'll now be in an HDR picture mode. And the other thing on here is that we now have our HDR target set as well. So we're going to target 2084 PQ for our EOTF, and we're going to target a 2020 color space. And those targets are set right here. Our white point is still D65. We are still set up well on the middle of that panel, and we do have no apparent gaps around the meter. Just make sure. I do see HDR in there, so I do know I'm in an HDR picture mode. I'm going to go ahead and stick with filmmaker mode. You notice I still have data in here from when I did the SDR calibration. I'm just going to wipe over the top of that. Now, I didn't save my data after the SDR calibration, so that does mean I'm wiping out the data. Ultimately, to me, that doesn't really matter. I don't need that data again, but if you want to, you can definitely save the data each step along the way, maintain that for posterity's sake, if you'd like to look back at the calibration later. All right, so our RGB data information is coming in now. We are seeing some luminance error, or some difference there on luminance, and we are seeing some red, green, and blue splits. We are seeing some DE errors that are higher because of those two things. We'll see how that color checker performs. Okay, and our color checker is getting close there. What we're seeing is that most of those colors are lining up pretty reasonably well. Our grayscale, there's nothing extremely out of line on a grayscale either. So all of that's looking pretty promising. We're going to go through the calibration, see how much we can improve it, see if we can get a little bit better on there, and overall have a better picture. All right, and so just like before, we're going to do our 2-point calibration next. Start with 80. I'm going to set myself to continuous readings. As I bring up some menus, the first couple of readings will be a little weird. All right, so I've got my gains and offsets. And now, because I am using a 10% window and I've got this menu on the screen, there's a part of me, I do expect I might have to do a little bit more, I might have a little bit more interaction with the menu and the readings I'm actually getting. Oops. Accidentally adjusted the wrong control. All right, so my blue gain, I've turned that down a little bit. Looks like a little too far, and I'm going to turn up my red gain just a little bit. Now, within Calman, I'm mostly looking at this RGB balance chart first to see where those are landing. We're going to see how close we can go. And the next one is I'm looking at the DE2000 chart to see what the result is. Again, what I'm really aiming for here is a DE of under 1. As I get pretty close, I'm going to move down to the 30%, make adjustments at the lower end. These controls, again, are going to interact with each other, so I'm not 100% aiming for perfection on either one. I'm aiming for overall a good balance between the two. All right, and now I'm going to pull the menu off the screen and just confirm what the behavior was on those both with the menu not up. So I do have a little bit of difference from what I measured with the menu up on the lower end. The upper end appears to be just about the same. So I do want to just go ahead and make a tweak on the lower end to try and account for that. And again, I'll measure that with the menu not up. And it is good to note that that we do see some difference from the menu, so that I know in other steps as well that the menu being up might affect how well I can take those readings. Okay, I'm still a little blue high on the bottom end. Okay, that looks great. I've got DE values there that are pointing me towards that it's time to stop. I've got under 1 on both my high end and my low end, and overall good color balance between those two. All right, and just like when I was doing the SDR calibration, I'm going to measure the grayscale, full grayscale sweep first. I'm going to look for where the errors are, and I'm going to kind of make some assessment at that point on what I want to do for that calibration on the multipoint. And as I do know that that menu was affecting my readings a little bit, that will probably affect my decision on how detailed I want to go. But again, most of what I'm going to use to base my decisions on is what the DE charts are telling me. So as those readings are coming in, I am seeing a couple delta E values that are a little bit elevated. Based on the red, green, and blue balance chart, the RGB balance charts, where we do not include luminance information, and where we do, it looks like most of that error is from luminance and not from balance. I do notice one other thing, which is that I've got this behavior where the luminance measured higher at 90% than it did at 100%, which indicates to me that I probably need to do something like increase my meter delay to account for maybe how dynamic that pattern is when it first lands on the screen. I'm just going to try and turn that up. I did turn that down for the SDR because it didn't seem to be affecting it with those full field patterns. But I think with the 10% window pattern and the active dimming that it's going to be doing for HDR, that probably is having a little bit more effect. And so again, what I'm going to look for there is that when we get to this clip point, that we're not seeing measurements, luminance measurements that are higher than our white measurement. Now, I don't think that the change of our delay will have had a big effect on, especially on our patterns that we were pulling up before to do like the RGB balance. And part of the reason I say that is because we were taking continuous measurements. So we were measuring over and over again with a patch, so we would have seen any of that unstableness get smoothed out pretty quickly. With that longer delay, I now notice that I no longer see that 90% and 80% were higher than 100%. So that's a good indication that that was a good choice to make. Now what I see is I do have, again, the red, green, and blue balance is really good. I have a good color balance across the board, so I'm not looking to make a bunch of changes there. I'm not tracking right on the PQ curve, so that's where most of my errors coming in is there. I'm going to just look and see what controls I have access to on the TV, and then we'll see how much I want to try and do about that. So back into my settings here, I have my local dimming set to high. Again, that makes sense for the HDR. I have this HDR tone mapping control that gives me the option of static and active. I'm going to try with that set to active and just see how that changes things. Because I'm just making one change that I'm not really sure what it's going to do, I'm just going to open a new history tab on here. And I just have that one change, and I'm going to take another set of readings. And that way I can just toggle back and forth. I can see what it looked like with that HDR tone map control set to static versus active, and I'll be able to then kind of make an assessment on if I think that's a good change to make or if I want to change it back. And while these readings are taking place, again, this is a good point to note that sometimes you're going to be faced with controls that either don't make sense, that you aren't quite sure what they do, or you just need to do a little discovery on. One of the easiest things to do is to just try and take some readings that you think might capture where they're going to affect stuff, and change them. Look to see what the effects are. On this one, I see that I now have really elevated levels through this middle section. So overall, that's not a change that I want to be in there. I do know that some of the other picture modes on this were set differently than that to begin with. So I'm going to set that one back to static, and I'm going to look for what other controls I have in here. Ignoring this history tab for a moment, because we already know what we wanted to learn from that one. What I'm seeing is overall, we're just a little bit over our PQ. curve. We do see a little bit bigger deviation right here where our roll-off point is, and that's to be expected. That's just general display behavior. We have a shadow detail control, which is going to affect how quickly the display comes out of black. Overall, how the display is coming out of black doesn't give me any concern, so I'm not looking to touch that one. We have this gamma slider value, which is kind of a control that would kind of line up with what we're seeing. So I am going to try and adjust that one and just see what it does. So I just took it down by 1 first. I'll take it down all the way first, see what effect it has, and then we can try and fine tune. So I don't have any value for what the data I have on history 2 anymore. I know what I already learned what I need to know there, so I'm just going to wipe out that data by reading over it. Okay, and the measurement data is starting to come in. I do see that control does seem to have an effect in exactly the type of place that we're looking at. So I'm now hitting under my target luminance, whereas before I was tracking along it or hitting a little bit over. It does look like I probably made too big of a change, which is not all that surprising, being that I did take the control down to its lowest value. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and adjust that control up a little bit again, since it does seem to be affecting what I want to change. Now I just want to find the right value for it. Because I'm going to be looking across the board, I've got a lot of measurements there. I'm going to use history tabs again so I can see how much the change is and which value looks like it's the best. I can compare them side by side. Okay, so I'm going to name this one -2, and then my history 1 tab is already, I have the value for it at 0. So I can compare 0, -3, -2, and I'll do -1 as well. I am seeing us just a little bit under our target luminance again with this -2 setting. All right, now that those readings are done, we can kind of toggle between these and see what we can see. Overall, this one, our luminance tracking does look like it is tracking really pretty closely. Our maximum DE value is here at about 70%. Let's look at our other values here. Okay, so it looks like -2 and -1 both are pretty close. I see a little bit more error with the -3 and a little bit more with the 0. So ultimately, I would most likely be choosing between these two. I think overall the -1 appears to be a bit closer to me. And also, if given the choice between more of an adjustment or less of an adjustment on a control, if I don't see something really pushing me towards one over the other, I'll tend to default to the one that I do less adjustment. All right, now we do know from the SDR calibration that the CMS controls weren't really functional on here. We're just going to go ahead and measure the CMS as it is and see where it's standing. Okay, and thankfully I'm not really seeing any big errors here. And I do want to just take some sweep readings. Now, as I start these sweeps, no flat panel TV is going to hit full saturation on 20/20 color space like this. The physics just doesn't work out for how you make the light. So with that said, we know that it's not going to hit full saturation, but I am interested to see what it's doing at multiple saturation levels within that color space and see how close it's coming or not. So it looks like for the red presentation that's already there, that's pretty good, where all of those values are really nicely aligned. You'll see that we'll probably hit, just not quite all the way out. That full saturation green is going to be even harder, so we're not going to hit that for sure. We'll probably trail off someplace over here once it's done. Okay, there we go. We are seeing that green trail off there. If I was measuring P3 within this 20/20 space, P3 is a little bit smaller color space, and it has a little bit more attainable targets. We might actually be pretty close to that. I'm not quite sure. So as I look at the secondaries are going to should be right in line with this blue to green. That's where we'd expect them to be. So I expect us to not be able to hit past about, so our full saturation cyan hit right here. And we're going to expect something kind of similar with the magenta, where it'll probably be kind of right here someplace. Because that should fall somewhere right on line with the full saturation blue and red. And again, nothing in there is giving me great big concerns. Of course, we know that we weren't going to be able to hit the full saturations, and that's fine. But the rest of the points mostly are lining up kind of where we'd expect them to be. And again, I have post-calibration information here from when I did my SDR calibration. You'll notice that it's now showing big errors because I'm targeting a different luminance different EOTF than I would have been for SDR. So let's take fresh readings there. Now the changes we think that we made on this HDR mode are we did try and get the luminance behavior in for matching PQ a little bit improved. We did balance the red, green, and blue a little bit more, so we're closer to true D65. We didn't really do anything with color space. We didn't try and do a global control adjustment. Most of the colors were lining up pretty closely, and especially in a HDR setting, I'd be more concerned that making changes there might introduce artifacts that I wasn't really aware of. So we didn't make any real changes there in that color space control. But the luminance adjustments and the grayscale balancing might have helped us some. We'll see when we get to those measurements. Overall, we do still have a little bit of bumps in our luminance on the grayscale. Not very much though. Overall, max error is 2.3, but our average error is under 1 for grayscale. So still very, very good calibration on here. And as we go through that post-calibration on the color checker, we'll see what that looks like. All right, we had some small errors on the color checker before we started. Does look like those probably got improved. We'll go ahead and check that pre-post comparison chart just a moment here. We can see if we made an improvement overall. All right, so before calibration, we were in a pretty good picture mode. So we had overall maxed E of 4.6 on our grayscale and 6.8 on our color checker. We did have some errors in there, but nothing was too egregious. We were able to do a nicer RGB balance across the board, hit a D65 across the board, and that definitely helped on our grayscale points, and we were able to track luminance a little bit better. Combined, while we didn't have CMS controls, we were able to get a little bit of improvement on our color checker values as well. So our max is down to 4.4, average is only 1.6, and our average for our grayscale is under 1. So overall, a very good calibration. All right, I hope that you found this review helpful. I hope that the tutorial helped. If you do run into questions while you're doing calibrations, feel free to reach out to our support. Also, feel free to poke around in your menus, see what's available, and just try things. You're not going to do any real damage, so you can always do resets if you want. So, but again, if you do run into questions, please feel free to reach out to us on support. Thanks very much.